Hey guys, welcome to Yesterday's Coffee, the podcast where we chat about fitness, nutrition, and business, all over coffee that may or may not have been brewed yesterday. And today we are chatting about exercise order and why workout programs are set up the way that we are. Well, the way that they are.
Yep.
We've already kind of chatted about why we choose specific exercises on certain, days of the week and kind of how to set up the exercises to target things that we want to accomplish, but we've never talked about why we put them in the specific order that they are in. And this is important for people who just, take a workout program and see it as a list of exercises to complete in any order that they want to, which happens sometimes.
It does.
But it's important to understand that there is a reason behind that specific order.
Right. So, you ask anybody that does anything in fitness, or they're a coach, or they have ever built a training program, and they're going to tell you that they didn't just haphazardly, well, I hope they didn't just haphazardly
they're a good coach.
throw a bunch of exercises onto a plate and say, here, go do them.
Just however you want.
However you like. So, because you get into a gym and sometimes things are taken up, and if you're not able to wait for a long period of time, maybe you've got to change up your exercise order. And there are instances where that makes sense to do. But more often than not, an exercise is written like a book. You should read it in order. You should perform it in order.
Yes.
And so what we're going to cover today are some of the methodologies and thought behind different ways of structuring your programs, because there are more than one way to do it.
There's not necessarily like a true right way to go about it. It does depend on your goals, and it does depend on how experienced you are. So we can take a look at, depending on what level you are, what might benefit you the most.
Definitely.
So tell me what would be best for like a beginner. So for somebody just starting out.
So the basic tenets of program design that you should hear is that you should be sticking with your compound movements first and then working down towards your isolation movements. So let's back up and define those. Compound movements are your exercises that involve multiple joints. They're the bigger exercises. So think your squats, your bench press, your deadlifts, things where a lot of different body parts are being used for one movement. Whereas your isolation movements are typically just involving one muscle group. You're trying to isolate one muscle. So a bicep curl, a tricep push down to some degree. Things of that nature. Those are going to be more of your isolation work. And so the common school of thought and what any beginner should really start with is starting with those compound multi-joint movements first, and then working your way down to the isolation movements.
Yes. True. If you try to start throwing a bunch of isolation movements into the beginning, you might end up fatiguing, these single muscles that your body is then going to need in a compound movement, which is honestly a good way to get hurt potentially, or just to feel crappy and not be able to complete the workout as well as you could have if you had started with the compound moves at the beginning.
Yeah.
But if your body's trying to compensate for fatigue in a certain muscle that you isolated before you went into your compound movement, that's where you can have some issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as a beginner, you're in a position where you have a major advantage. So because you're not used to training, everything that you do is basically going to make you improve, grow, get stronger, get faster, whatever. But when you are brand new to it, you want to be sticking with exercises that involve the most musculature first. And there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, you don't really have a lot of practice with these movements. So we want you doing the things that are going to give you the most bang for your buck up front. When you're fresh, you're going to have the best technique. You're going to have the best ability to learn the movement. And then you're also going to see the biggest result from those exercises. One of the big mistakes a lot of guys make when they're first starting out is doing way too much. So you get in there, you're starting to follow this bodybuilder's program, and he's got 6 different chest exercises when really all you need to be focused on is maybe doing bench press and push-ups. Something very simple to stimulate that muscle group, allow you to get stronger progressively. And then as you start to advance more and more, that's where incorporating additional stuff can really help. But in the beginning, we're just trying to stimulate the muscle and then give it time to recover, grow, and adapt, and then repeat that process over and over again. And so those compound movements should take priority.
Definitely. I mean, you get, like you said, you get the most for it. And if you're going through, again, you might get tired out easily. So you would want to start with those exercises that are going to require more energy from you instead of, just choosing to start with bicep curls because you like them.
Right.
And then end up getting to some of the most beneficial exercises, excuse me, and not being able to complete them or not being able to do them well.
Right. And I think the vast majority of the time for the vast majority of people, you should be sticking with that paradigm of compound movements first and then following up with isolation movements. Stick with the exercise order of importance because you're going to get a lot more out of those compound movements from a strength standpoint, a muscle building standpoint. So like if you're a power lifter, you're never going to be worried about doing anything before your compound movements because you want to be as fresh as possible for those exercises because you're trying to perform at the highest level and the highest strength capacity. So
then what about somebody who is more advanced or somebody who's not a power lifter, somebody who's like trying to make their muscles bigger?
Right. So it really comes down to a question of, okay, it makes a lot of sense to do the most important exercises first. Why on earth would I ever not do the exercises that are supposedly more bang for my buck first?
Yeah, because most of the programs that you'll see will always start with those compound movements.
And there is a reason for not doing them first. One of the reasons being fatigue. So as you get stronger, as you've been lifting for a longer period of time, the more these compound movements are taxing overall. So a term, axial loading, is basically how much resistance are you putting on your spine, on the trunk of your body. And that's what all of these big movements do. So your squats, you're loading on your back. Your deadlifts, you're holding it in your hands, but it's your back is the lever of the movement. So all of these things have these major full body fatiguing elements to them. And as you get stronger, the more of those things that you stack up, the more that starts to wear out your lower back, your core, and
your smaller muscles.
Yeah, so all of those smaller muscles that are so important for keeping your form strict and tight. Because as you get stronger, the more you're going to need to use heavier weights. And
or go through more reps or go through more sets, which, again, you could, and Kyle will get to this in a second, we can put some isolation movements in front of these big compound lifts to start to kind of like pre-fatigue that muscle a little bit in order to not have to continue increasing weight or increasing reps or increasing sets of those compound movements because, again, you're going to end up tearing up your back or you're going to end up tearing up your joints unnecessarily.
Potentially. Yeah, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be talking about injury here. So a lot of times you'll see at the professional bodybuilding level, they'll actually put a lot of their compound movements towards either the middle or the end of their workout. And you got to think of it like this. If I'm somebody that can rep 600 pounds on a squat, and that's what it's going to require to really stimulate my quads, that is majorly taxing. So if I do that first thing in my workout, then the rest of my workout is going to be totally shot, or I'm going to be at like 70% or less because 600 pounds on your back, I don't care how strong you are, is going to wear you out. Whereas if instead I start putting lunges and leg extensions and some other stuff in front, and I can really maximally stimulate my quads in those exercises, then I can throw the squats in on the back end. And while I may not be able to use as much weight, I can still get massive muscular recruitment from that. And my overall effective volume from the session is much higher.
Definitely.
So instead of that first exercise being the only thing I'm 100% at, and then everything else is 70, 60% or less, the first 3 exercises, maybe I'm 90 to 100%, and then maybe squats are 80%. So the overall intensity and the overall effectiveness of those exercises is that much higher. But again, this is an example of a professional bodybuilder, somebody that is insanely strong.
Yes,
so
very strong.
This is not a guy that's been working out for 2 years and is trying to do this, because we also know that pre-fatiguing, which is basically doing a bunch of isolation exercises before doing your compound movements, does not lead to more muscle recruitment.
Yeah. And
so that's a common thought that...
by pre-fatiguing, you mean working that muscle to complete exhaustion.
Exactly, yeah. So with one of these training concepts that got put forth back in like Arnold's heyday, back in the 70s, was doing pre-fatigue, so taking an isolation movement basically to failure, and then following that up with a compound movement. So if we're talking very simply, you could pre-fatigue with leg extensions, burn your quads out, going to failure with that, and then moving on to squats afterwards. And there have been numerous studies done with EMG data, which is where they hook you up with the electrodes, sense how much electricity is coming through that muscle. And every single time, if you pre-fatigue to failure, then that compound movement doesn't benefit whatsoever.
No, you get significantly weaker, and you're not really
right
getting the benefit of the pre-exhaustion phase.
Right, because the whole idea behind the concept is if I fatigue this muscle with an isolation movement, then more muscle fibers are going to be forced to be recruited to make the compound movement work. But it doesn't quite work that way. And anybody that's ever really pushed themselves to failure on an isolation movement, so in that instance with leg extensions and then squats, if you ever try to really squeeze your quads while you're squatting after that type of exercise, you can't contract it nearly as hard. So that makes sense. But there is also merit to still performing isolation exercises first, even if you're not the strongest person in the world.
Yeah, so there's benefit for people who are like moderately skilled. I don't know what word I'm looking for. Like, or people in the middle. And like not really for beginners necessarily, but like a step up.
Beginners, I would never worry about pre-fatiguing or anything like that.
You just don't need to.
There's also a difference between pre-fatiguing and what's the word I'm looking for? Stimulating a target muscle group. So you can use, and this is a very effective technique, you can use an isolation movement to help warm up a target muscle group before a compound movement. But the key here is not taking it to failure. So whereas all of those studies are taking that isolation movement to failure first, if you were to say take the leg extension, or a lot of them will use like pec deck and a bench press. Say you're somebody that has a lot of trouble recruiting their pecs during any sort of chest movement, then it might be a really good idea to find an isolation movement where you can feel your pecs working and do a few sets of that with lightweight, really focusing on the contraction before your bench press, not to take anything anywhere near fatigue, but just to basically prime your nervous system to send that muscular impulse to that working muscle to allow you to get a better contraction in the compound movement there. And I know there's not a whole lot of evidence-based practice or like studies around that particular thing, not that I've found. And to be fair, I didn't really look that long, but because a lot of them are just looking at total isolation failure beforehand. But anecdotally, this is a practice that a lot of guys use and have been using for a long time, especially with stubborn body parts, because if you're constantly just hitting the compound movement first and trying to fatigue something, but you're never feeling your chest work in the bench press, it's probably not going to be growing as well as it could be. So trying to introduce that isolation movement first can be beneficial as long as you're not pushing too far with it and you're still able to contract maximally with that compound movement.
Definitely. So you're mentally connecting to that muscle. And like you said, you're priming your nervous system to be activating that muscle more efficiently than it would be if you were just coming in cold. So in that same vein, kind of backtracking a little bit, there is a benefit, potentially for beginners doing something like this, but more as a warm-up, right? So something
Correct.
like a dynamic warm-up where we're doing, maybe body-weighted exercises and kind of just practicing making that mental connection to the muscle that you're supposed to be working once we add a little bit of weight on.
Exactly.
But again, this isn't pushing you to exhaustion. This isn't really fatiguing your muscles at all. This is literally us just making that like mind to muscle connection that can help you be more effective when you go into your actual workout.
Right. And there's so much with muscle building, and there's so many different components to it. You also can't just take EMG data as the sole point of muscle building, because just because you can get a better contraction doesn't necessarily mean that doing compound first is always going to be the best case for muscle building. There are plenty of other factors with metabolite buildup based on how long your sets are in duration, time under tension. There's so much to it. So there's plenty of times where even if you're not the strongest bodybuilder in the world, maybe you do start changing up the order of your routine just to be a totally new stimulus. So if you've been squatting first in your workouts for the last 4 years, try flipping that order completely around.
Yeah, just try something new.
And see what it's like to do your squats as the last exercise, because it's going to feel totally different.
Well, at that point, it's just another variable of intensity. Like we've talked about in a lot of podcasts, like you said, manipulating certain variables to continue increasing intensity week over week or month over month or within some sort of workout cycle, because that's how you make progress.
Right.
No matter what your goals are, is continuously overloading your body in a certain way. So this would just be another measure of intensity for some people.
Right, because you got to look at the EMG data on the flip side too. So if we know that doing exercises when you're freshest is when you're going to have the highest level of recruitment, then if we start flipping your workout around and now your squats at the end of the workout, well, guess what? Now those accessory exercises that you were normally doing fatigued are going to be done a lot fresher. So now you're going to be able to get stronger on those. You're going to be able to build new muscle from those movements. And so it goes both ways. So just because we're not getting that peak EMG contraction on a squat because it's the fourth exercise now, doesn't mean that all is lost.
It's not beneficial, yeah.
Yeah, the exercises up front are now going to be getting a lot more of that done. And so you can target a lot of different muscles that way. You can target different areas of certain muscles that way. So it's all worth taking into account.
Well, and I think this may not need to be said, but I'm going to say it anyway, just for some people, because I've run into this issue. If you've never tried pre-exhaustion before, if you decide to try it, just be aware that those compound lifts are going to be lighter weight than if you started at the beginning, just because sometimes it can be significantly different.
Oh, yeah.
And so don't just like load up the bar with your normal amount of weight after you go through all these sets of pre-exhaustion, because you're going to feel like you're going to die.
Yeah.
So just like, again, I maybe shouldn't have to say it, but like not everybody knows, and I get that. So just be aware that you will be taking your weight down in those compound lifts, and obviously play around with it, see how much you can push it, but don't start with your like normal weight potentially.
Yeah, and that's another reason why you really want to be well practiced with these compound movements before you ever try anything like pre-fatigue, because it's going to be so much harder to maintain proper technique when you're fatigued.
Much harder.
That if you don't know what you're doing when you're fresh, this is the last thing you need to touch.
Yeah.
So that, it's
like your
it's not
technique should be pretty perfect on your compound lifts before trying the pre-exhaustion, because it really does open you up to potential for injury, because those muscles are going to be fatigued. It's going to end up dumping into some of your other supporting muscles, which could potentially be weak. If those are weak, they could get injured, and so on and so on.
And so now we're about to contradict ourselves, because one of the last reasons why you might do some sort of pre-fatigue or warm up with isolation movements before a compound movement is actually for injury prevention. And so
it will make sense in a minute.
So what I mean by this, there are certain exercises that are a little bit harder on your joints if you're not properly warmed up. So, and it tends to go really well with certain muscles, especially smaller muscle groups. So one of the first exercises that stood out in my mind is skull crushers. So this being an awesome tricep movement, but a lot of people have trouble with their elbows with it because it's a lot of stress on the elbow. If you're trying to really load up your triceps, which are a pretty strong muscle group, even though they're fairly small overall, they can take quite a beating. And that smaller joint, the elbow, can undergo a lot of stress. So one of the common things that I try to do, and I know a lot of other coaches try to do, is really make sure you're warmed up before using any variation of a skull crusher. So making sure that your arms are already pretty pumped up, triceps, biceps too. And antagonistic muscles can make a big difference as well. So if somebody's got really cranky elbows and trying to do a bunch of tricep, that's
me.
term.
I have cranky elbows, actually.
So if somebody has issues with training their triceps because their elbows are always giving them a hard time, then I'll try to give them a bunch of bicep work first to get blood flow into their arms. And that can help a lot. And I tend to structure most of my arm sequences that way, with some sort of bicep work first, because the biceps don't tend to have any sort of issues around the elbow joint. Theirs is normally up in the shoulder. If there are issues, not to say that they can't, but once the blood flow is in there, that helps everything start working the way that it should, feels a lot better, and then you can start pushing those exercises a little bit harder. So, and especially if you're somebody that, again, is very strong and maybe your lower back's been acting up, and we're going to bring back the quad situation again, instead of going straight to squats and having to use a ton more weight to really load up your quads, again, we can pre-fatigue those muscle groups in the leg first by doing some isolation work, some lunges, some stuff that isn't loading up your lower back. And then because you're fatigued, by the time you get to the squats on the end, you're not going to have to go nearly as heavy, but you're still going to get that great stimulus from the workout overall.
So preventing injury.
Exactly.
Definitely. So doing it the wrong way can cause injury, but doing this the right way when it's needed can actually help you prevent injury. And so again, I think it goes back to the difference between like a warm up and doing it like with the intention of exhausting the muscle or fatiguing the muscle.
I mean, that just sounds like exercise in general.
Yeah.
You do it right, it's good for you.
Basically,
you don't do it right, it's not good for you.
That's 100% the truth. So, I mean, no, it's a great tool to use. And just about everybody can use it in some capacity. It just depends on the goal.
Absolutely. So rule of thumb, stick with compound first, follow it up with isolation. If you're incredibly strong and you're very competent in the compound movements and you've been doing it that way for a long time, maybe try switching it up if your primary focus is on building muscle. If your primary focus is on strength, it should pretty much always be compound first. Again, unless you're doing some sort of injury prevention, something. Priority should be in that compound movement if you're trying to get stronger. But otherwise, feel free to mix it up. Feel free to throw in some of those isolation movements, not fully fatiguing the muscle beforehand, but just as an activation exercise before your compound movements. And that can be really beneficial too. So yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's about it. Well, thank you guys so much for watching or listening today. If you have any topics you'd like us to cover, you can reach out to me at therootedrd.com, or you can reach out to Kyle at hypertrofit.com. But we will see you guys next week. See you next week.